All right, the example videos for Chapter 7, our chapter on risk and return, are going to be a little bit different than the previous chapters. The calculations themselves are relatively straightforward and ones you've been doing long before you got into this class. So what we're going to talk about in these videos is, instead of going through the actual calculations and just showing them going into the calculator, we'll talk about the concepts behind why we care about these particular calculations, what they measure, and what they tell us about risk, and then what happens to these measures, what tells us about risk and return, and what happens to these measures as we start combining things into a portfolio. So this first video is going to look at table 7.1 and example 7.2.1, where we find the average return for two stocks, and then example 7.2.2, where we find the realized return for two stocks, are based on the data in this table. So we're going to cover both of these examples, and we'll talk a little bit about standard deviation as well, which we don't actually calculate in any of the homework problems, but it is important to know what it actually measures so that we can have a sense of what happens with risk later on when we start combining assets into a portfolio. Okay, so let's take a look at this table first. In table 7.1, what we have are annual returns for two stocks. We have Initech, which is a technology company that makes, it's a made-up company. They make high-end mobile devices. And then we have Edison Power, which is an established regulated utility. So they provide residential and commercial power to folks who live in the Northeast. Okay, and then we have these returns mapped from 2016 year by year through 2021. And then we just have the economic conditions noted in these years here. And again, this is made up. This is not actually tracking data, although it does track somewhat closely to reality. What was going on in 2016 and 2017 is that we were in the midst of an economic boom. So GDP was expanding and incomes were rising. So we can see what happened to the returns for these particular stocks in that particular economic environment. In years 2018 and 2019, things were a little more normal. So more like a 2-3% GDP growth per year, as opposed to a boom year, which would be, say 6% or more GDP growth. So in 2018, 2019, things were a little more normal. We can see the returns for those two stocks. And then we entered a recession in 2020 and 2021, and we can see the returns for these two stocks. Okay, let's just take a look at the returns real quick before we look at the calculations. Edison Power, a regulated utility company. Remember that stocks, when you purchase a share of stock and you are now a shareholder, what you own is a piece of the firm, and so you are entitled to your portion of the firm's future earnings. Now, the firm also needs to decide to pay those out as dividends before you receive them as cash flow, but we have shareholder meetings to decide what sort of dividend payouts we're going to make, and shareholders will approve those kind of things. And a lot of times you want the company to retain their revenue so they can invest in the firm and grow it rather than pay it out. But in any case, you are entitled to those future earnings. So when we see share prices move, what we're really seeing is the market's expectation on future income. So when share prices are rising, that means information has come out that we expect future revenues for the company, or future earnings for the company, I should say, to be higher than what was expected. So we can see in boom times, both Edison Power and Initech are up. Edison Power is a regulated utility. Their profit margins are set by their regulating authority, by a government agency most of the time. And so we know their profit margins, and then people tend to use about the same amount of power no matter what the economic conditions are. Perhaps if manufacturing ramps up, there'll be a little more power consumption and that kind of thing. But it's relatively stable and relatively predictable. So you don't get a lot of revenue surprises or earnings surprises with a regulated power utility like that. So we can see there's not a lot of movement in Edison Power. In fact, the highest return in any year is 4.1%, a positive 4.1%, which was in the boom time of 2016. And the lowest return we see out of this 6-year period is a minus 1.2% return. So pretty narrow window of returns you could expect as a shareholder if you were invested in Edison Power. Now, Initech, on the other hand, being a high-end technology company, is going to have a lot more variability. If the market, if the economy is doing really well, people have jobs, they're expecting raises, they're expected to be able to move up to better jobs, their income looks like it's going to be going up, They feel pretty confident in their income, but they're probably more likely to spend money trading in their phones every 6 months or every year and getting the Ultra Max Super Beta Plus, whatever's coming out this year. Right? So a company like Initech, think Apple as a model for Initech. So when things are going really well, this company does really, really well, and they generate a lot more earnings than would have been anticipated if we were not under those economic conditions. In normal times, they still do pretty well. They've got pretty high profit margins because they make premium devices, so they can charge a lot for them and make a lot of money on them. But when things are bad, things can be pretty bad for them. They can't sell their premium devices, and they're just stuck with all of that, all of their operating costs that they can't get rid of. And so there tend to be negative earning surprises in recessions as people keep their devices longer or buy cheaper devices if they're uncertain about their income. And so we get a lot more variability in a company like this. In fact, we can see in 2016 was also the highest return for Initech. It was a positive 88.1% for them. And then the lowest return was in 2021, and it was a minus 15.1%. So a lot more variability there and a lot more of a roller coaster ride you're going on as a shareholder if you were invested in Initech. So we can calculate some basic statistics to get our arms around what these returns look like, what the data look like, and what they tell us about what it would be like to invest in these companies. The first one we'll look at is the average return, and this is what's calculated in example 7.2.1, right below this. And the average return is just an arithmetic average that you've been calculating since middle school. We're going to calculate it using equation 7.1, where we're going to add up all of the returns and then divide by the number of returns that we see. So if we look at Initech, the first thing we're going to do, because we're doing arithmetic with these, is we're going to convert all the percentages to decimals, although in this case it wouldn't really matter. You could leave them as percentages, but just as a matter of habit, we'll go ahead and convert them to decimals, because sometimes it does matter when we do that, and until you get comfortable with it, it's hard to know when it does and when it doesn't. So it's best to just go ahead and always convert them to decimals when you're going to be doing arithmetic with them. We just take all the returns year by year and add them up. And I did them starting in 2016, running up through 2021. So the first one was 88.1%, the second one was 35.4%, and so on all the way to the minus 15.1% in 2021. So that's exactly what we've got here. We're just adding them all up, being careful to make sure we record the negative returns as negatives. So we're actually going to subtract the 10% here and subtract the 15.1% here. We had 6 total returns, so we'll just divide by 6 once we add those up, and we'll get an average of 23.65%. Okay, what is that average? That average gives us a sense of sort of the center of gravity of this particular sample of returns. That is, what did the returns tend to cluster around? Right? In fact, if we look at, there's a bell curve just below this. If we were to, this is just a generic bell curve, it doesn't map this particular data set, but the average or mean would be right here in the center, kind of the center of gravity where most of the returns tend to cluster around. So over this 6-year period for Initech, the returns tended to be about 23.65%. And now what else does that tell us, and what can we use it for? Oftentimes we will use this as our best guess about what to expect next period. So since the average over the 6-year period for Initech was 23.65%, we don't really know what to expect next year. So we just say, well, our best guess is that it'll be about 23.65% next year as well, since that was the average over the last 6 years. Now, in real life, we would bring more data into that and say, hey, what do we expect economic conditions to be? And we can adjust our guess based on that. But just as a baseline guess, the average is not a bad place to start for what to expect next period. If we do the same thing for Edison Power, we just take all the observations and add them up, being careful to record that one negative observation as a negative, add them up, divide by 6, and we see the average was 2.57% for Edison Power. Now, not real surprising, the whole risk-return relationship, we've got a lot more risk with Initech, so we've got a higher average return, or we could even say perhaps a higher expected return if we're thinking of it that way. And we've got a much lower return for Edison Power, and there's a lot less variability there as well. So that starts to hint at this relationship between risk and return. But how do we measure risk? Well, the place we start is with standard deviation. And I know we don't calculate it here, but we do want to talk about it a little bit. What standard deviation does is it takes these return observations and it's going to subtract each one of them from the mean. So for example, in 2016, it'll take 2.5% minus 4.1% and look at that difference, or flipped. You take the 4.1% minus 2.5%. We'll look at the distance between the average return and then the actual return, and then we'll square that to take out differences between positives and negatives. We just want to know the absolute distance between the average return and the actual return. We'll do that for every single return. We'll add all of those up and then divide by the number of observations that we've got. So what the standard deviation gives is, on average, how far away from the mean does each observation tend to be? So the average tells us about where they tend to cluster, and then the standard deviation tells us about how far away the actual returns tend to be. The larger the standard deviation, the farther away from the mean you can expect to be in any given period. So this is a good measure of risk. If we think the average return is 2.57%, so that's kind of our best guess about what to expect next period, and we could expect that next period's return is not going to be too far away from that, because on average, it's only about 2% away. So maybe it's about 2% above this, maybe it's about 2% below us, but it's going to be pretty close. It's going to be somewhere between, say, 0.1% or 0%, somewhere flat, up to, say, what, this is 2.5% plus 2, so 4.5%, 5%, something like that. That window will capture most of our returns for Edison power. If we look at Initech, the standard deviation for this company is much, much larger, 37.23%. That means the average for Initech was 23.65%, but the standard deviation, so the average distance each of these observations are away from that mean, is 37.23%, which is even larger than the average return. Okay? So if we look at this chart for standard deviation, if we're assuming a standard normal distribution, which is often where we start, we can make small adjustments to it if we need to, if the distribution looks different. But this is good enough to get our arms around the concept. We would map out the mean right here. So for Initech, this would be that 23.65%. And then if we went up one standard deviation, so mu here, the Greek letter mu is what we tend to use for mean, and then sigma is what we tend to use for standard deviation. If we start at the mean and go up one standard deviation, so we say 23.65% plus the 37.23%, which is the standard deviation. So we go up plus that, so we're a little over 50% here, return. And then we also go minus one standard deviation. We take that 23.65% minus the 37% standard deviation. So we're in negative return territory here. That bracket, that window from the minus, in fact, we've got them here. So the upper end of that would be 60.8%. The low end of it would be minus 14.4%. That window would capture about 68% of all returns within that sample. So we could say with about 68% confidence that next period's return we expect to be somewhere between minus 14.4% and plus 60.8%. So that's a pretty big window. That's a lot of risk. All right, if we do that same calculation for Edison power, the average is 2.5%, so that would be the center of gravity right here. And then we add one standard deviation to it, we get a high of 4.1%. Right? That's what would go right here with this mu plus sigma. And then we get a low of minus 1.2% down here. So, and that will capture about 68% of all of the observations in that sample. So we could say with that, next period, we expect the return to be about 2.57%. And we can say with 68% confidence that next period's return will be somewhere between minus 1.2% and plus 4.1%. So a much narrower range of possibilities, which we could already see looking at the chart, but this really puts it in a picture for us and gives us a more concrete way to think about it. Right? So the takeaway from that is the lower the standard deviation, the less risk there is within this particular asset. And the higher the standard deviation, the more risk there is within this particular asset. Okay, one more thing to talk about before we get off of this example. We're going to look at calculating realized return for an example 7.2.2. The average return measures what tended to happen, but an investor is going to be concerned with what actually happened. What return did I actually earn if I were to hold this stock over this period and realize these returns? That's what realized return captures. And if we look at the formula for realized return, it should look kind of familiar. Here we're going to take each return, so this is return in the first period plus 1. We're going to multiply that by the return in the second period plus 1, and we do that for however many returns that we have. Now what's going on here? Why are we doing this particular calculation? Well, if we were to buy, say for example, Initech stock at the beginning of 2016 and earn an 88.1% return, that means the value of our asset went up 88.1%. We held that asset through 2017 and then earned 35.4%. Well, we have compound interest happening there. We're going to earn in 2017 35.4% not only on the initial investment that we made into the stock, but also on the additional 88.1% return that we earned in 2016. And that compounding is going to happen every period that we hold the stock. All right, so we have to account for that compounding to measure our actual return, and that's what happens when we take each return, add it to 1, and then multiply it by the next return, added to 1, and so on. Now, that's going to give us, if that's all we did, that would give us just a total compounded return over the 6-year period. Most of the time, we report returns on an annual basis, so in order to annualize this, we're going to raise it to the 1 over n, where n is the number of years of observations we are looking at here. Okay, and that'll take it down from a total return to an realized annual return for this period. So that's what the exponent does for us here. And then of course we got to subtract 1 off because we added 1 to all these guys to make the math work for us. And we take that back off and we can make it work. So we can see that calculation here. And we find that the realized return, so if you're an investor who purchased Initech stock at the beginning of 2016, held it through 2021, your annual realized return would have been about 19.31%, which is lower than the average because of the way compound return works, and we've got these 2 negative returns on the end here that really bring down our actual realized return. And we do the same thing for Edison Power, go through the same calculation, and we see that the realized return is about 2.55%, which was pretty close to the average return, and that's because there's much less variability involved there. So the compound returns aren't playing as large a role, especially because they're smaller returns. Okay, so what is the difference between the average return and the realized return? The average return just measures what tended to happen over a given period, and then the realized return measures what you would have actually earned as an investor over this period, and this is on an annualized basis. Right? So those two together give the investor a lot of information about this particular asset. Usually coupled with the standard deviation, you can start to see some relationships between risk and return, but there's some nuance to that we'll talk about in the next few examples.